Welcome to part two of the lecture. We've been discussing community and the importance of communication with your publics. Regardless of the characteristics of your publics, uh, effective communication should do several things. First, it should use clear and simple language. I see this often in writing where students will try to communicate a simple idea and try to use extensive words or big words. And the problem with this is that um, it clouds communication at times. So just be simple, state what you'd like to say simply, and make sure that you might run it past a few people to make sure it is stated clearly and simple. Effective communication frames the essential questions that will guide the dialogue. So, what do we mean by that? I want you to think about what goal you're trying to accomplish in any communication. So, for example, if you are posting a web page, think to yourself, what is I'd like to come out of this web page with? What do people need to come out of this web page with? What's the essential idea, essential information? And and then that becomes your essential question. And then the next step is, well, how does this best accomplish that? Effective communication establishes an open process for conducting dialogue. So getting back to that trust issue, that everyone feels like everything is above board and transparent. Effective communication promotes ownership by using collective pronouns such as our and we. So we are a school-based, a community-based school. Our community, our school, rather than their and they. And finally, effective communication capitalizes on existing communication resources. So, for example, your school may already have a web page. So it probably does. And so rather than redesigning something for a special effort, how can you build on that web page and incorporate? If you're going to do a podcast, how can it be incorporated into the existing web page? This also implies existing communication resources, also implies that you go out into the community and locate who might be there willing to help you with that communication effort. A number of you mentioned that it might be difficult to have a budget for communication with the publics, but there may also already be individuals or corporations or other community groups that would be willing to assist you with the effort. Speaking of communication outlets, here's a list of ways that you can go about to get your message out there. Some of them are high cost and some of them are fairly low cost. Print media we're moving away from, but there are still schools that send home paper newsletters, for example. Broadcast media, I mentioned before, some of you might have. Virtually everyone now has access to internet, and there are free sites and wikis and things that you can take advantage of. School or district sponsored newsletters, these may be digital newsletter. Public forums to discuss issues. So if we are having a new initiative, come and air your opinion. It's one good way to help people feel like they're being heard and to obtain buy-in. Open houses often work quite well, particularly for new programs or the start of a school year, for example. Extracurricular events might surprise you to realize that that is a communication outlet. But if you have the champion team in something, getting that message out there through an event and attaching the name of your school to it is also a way to have positive community relationships. Similarly with academic programs. Parent groups in the United States, we have, for example, PTA, Parent Teacher Association, and one of the stated missions of these types of groups is positive community relations with the schools. They can help you get your word out. Partnership programs, for example, with businesses in your community can be very helpful. For the principal to get out and go to a luncheon, for example, with business groups is not a bad idea to promote those relationships. And finally, conferences, such as professional conferences, where you present, as I do quite often, might be a way, if you're attached to a university or a school, to get your positive message out. Even if you're presenting on an unrelated topic, they do see your name and they do know that good things are going on at the school. I'd like to talk for a little bit about developing positive relationships with a special subgroup, and that's parents. And probably more than any other internal public, parents are justifiably involved with our schools. And so the question is, why should they be involved? And I would put forth that there are three reasons. First, it's philosophically justified. We want our parents to understand in education what's going on in their children's lives. It's politically astute, because when parents are involved politically, we gain power because we have more buy-in. And professionally, it's reasonable. There's been a great deal of research that suggests that students whose parents are involved with the schools obtain higher grades, higher test scores, experience greater self-esteem, higher levels of motivation, and better attendance records. We have to be a little careful in assuming that one causes the other. It may not be a causal relationship. It may be just a correlational relationship, but it is there. Kowalski wrote in 2011 that principals who only interact with parents when they are forced to respond to or provide negative news are least likely to have productive relationships. And this makes sense. If the only time a parent sees a principal is to receive bad news, the parent's going to have a negative view of the principal and most likely of the school. So you want to start to develop parent relationships that capitalize on positive events and positive relationships. Epstein and et al. In 1997 defined 6 functions that help school-family collaboration, and these are both influences and outcomes. First of all, home-to-school communication. However that happens. I know that we used to talk of a hole in the backpack for students, and that is many notices were sent home and sometimes they didn't get home. But in today's digital age, we're able to email and communicate with parents much more effectively. School-to-home communication, similarly, there has to be a system set up that's reliable that takes communication from the school into the home. We need to encourage parents as volunteers. Sometimes it can be difficult, but at the same time, I would argue that the benefits far outweigh the difficulties. When we get parents into the school as volunteers, we get them involved in governments and decisions. And getting back to the 4 variables that we talked about, that would be a good way to establish trust and transparency. But it flows the other way too. Out of these decisions that the school can make comes a more positive home learning environment and a greater collaboration. What you see here is a diagram that talks about the different steps that can be taken to create a public relations plan. This week, we'll be talking in greater depth, and you'll be examining more public relations plans. So let's start with the first stage, which is analyzing parental involvement through an engagement audit. What do I mean by an engagement audit? This is a step that you can take to determine just how engaged the various publics are in your school. Because this week we're talking about external communities, we're talking about, for example, parents, but you can also do an engagement audit with your faculty. As a matter of fact, your action research project is a mini engagement audit. In an engagement audit, you start by inventorying the number of positive and negative interactions that occur and grouping them by activities. So, for example, how many music programs, which we could agree would be positive, are there? How many parent-teacher conferences, which could be either positive or negative? How many discipline problems? Obviously negative. So these You can tally up and get a sense of how many interactions are going on with your parents and sort of group them by, well, on the whole, are we having more positive interactions or more negative? We can collect and analyze teacher and parent opinions regarding the productivity of these interactions, the effectiveness of communication during these interactions, and the mutual treatment during these interactions. We can collect and analyze data as to why some families have not had any interactions with school personnel. So I want to talk about these two bullets that I just mentioned. Your interviews and your action research might be one way to do this, to sit down with various publics and to ask questions such as, what do you know about the school, and what would you like to know? What do you feel like you're not getting? We're doing a very brief set of questions because it's a brief project. However, in a full engagement audit, you might consider expanding those questions. You might consider interviewing more than just two people. Obviously, you would want to interview several people from each of the publics. You could determine what types of information parents find most useful, least useful, and want but do not receive. Again, much like our action research project. And you could seek suggestions about ways to improve interactions. The next step would be, once you have looked at your data, to follow that up and create an action team. The action team would be a group of people to coordinate the process of building a public relations plan. And this would be an involvement plan. It would be linked to your school goals and objectives, and even your mission statement. And it would have goals and strategies for improving public involvement. But in this case, because we're talking about parents here, parent involvement. Policies and regulations need to be in place that provide a safeguard framework for professional interactions to take place. So, for example, who will be the designated point person to speak to the medium? This would be an example of a policy you would need to consider. Several of you have commented in your posting that public relations plans require support, and this is absolutely true. Administrators must be willing to allocate human and material resources to implement that plan. Sometimes a lot, sometimes a little, and you must take into account your budgeting constraints when you're developing your public relations plan. You must train your staff and faculty on the plan because they will be involved. And finally, you must think about how to evaluate the plan in a periodic and on an ongoing basis. Is this plan working? And this could be something that your action team agrees to meet regularly, perhaps once a year, look over the plan and adjust it. In conclusion, collaborative relationships between the school and parents, and I would argue all publics, are an ongoing developmental process of mutual or reciprocal empowerment. And I like that word empowerment because when good things flow in a two-way process, the end result, of course, is that our students benefit. This is the end, and you can see I've listed the references here that were used in case you'd like to pursue any of these topics further. Thank you.